Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to this third and final day of our Future of Evaluation event. For those of you joining us for the first time today, I am Sabine Bernabè, the Vice President and Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. And today we will have two very interesting sessions. The first will focus on the critical question of how international organizations can best partner with and support countries as they develop and institutionalize their systems of monitoring and evaluation. This is a question that occupies my colleague Dugan Fraser, the program leader of the Global Evaluation Initiative, a global partnership dedicated to evaluation capacity development. Dugan will be moderating this discussion. The final session, a bit later this morning, will address the implications of the data revolution for evaluation. Data science, machine learning, and artificial intelligence hold the promise of greater efficiency, deeper insights, and increased quality. Dion Filmer, the director of the World Bank Research Group, will moderate a discussion on how the influence of new technologies on the gathering and use of data and the implications of how we approach evaluations and learning from evidence. So once again, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your insights and perspectives. I'll now hand over to Dugan.
Hello, Sabine, and welcome everybody. It's very nice to be with you today. Thank you for this opportunity to share what is a really, really important topic. Hi, I'm going to start again. Hi, everybody. I'm Dugan Fraser. As Sabine said, I'm the program manager of the Global Evaluation Initiative. Very nice to have you here with us today. I'm going to hand over immediately to Ian, who's going to provide the opening remarks. Over to you, Ian.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be with you today, and great to have an opportunity to be part of this Future of Evaluation series. So I want to just talk a little bit about why evaluation, we need to do some rethinking of evaluation before we talk about institutionalizing evaluation. Sometimes governments want evidence, sometimes they don't. And it's really important to have an ecosystem where all stakeholders have an opportunity to push for evidence. In Andrea's presentation on Monday, she talked about 2,000 plus UN evaluations since 2020. How much difference have these made in terms of really changing development trajectories? And the reality is many factors affect decision-making, and above all, it's the intersection of money and politics in both rich and poor countries. As we see with the lack of action on climate change, it took to COP28 for to really admit that we actually needed to reduce fossil fuels. And of course, the figures on climate change are really quite frightening. So these are the recent sea surface temperatures, which are going up extremely high. And of course, the reason is that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the levels were 316 parts per million when I was born. It's now 423 parts per million. This is combined with inequality. Actually, of the carbon emissions, 15% comes from the top 1%. 34% comes from the next 9%, which is most of us on this call. So but we are responsible for around 50% of carbon emissions. And of course, the top 1%, the next 9%, you can see on the figures on the right, are making these huge contributions. So we're the ones who are consuming, and it's from our consumption that it's driving these emissions. And of course, this is combined with the challenge of ecosystems damage, with many plants, mammals, fish at severe risk, and huge losses of insects, etc. So the current system is actually maximizing focusing on profit maximization is creating an unlivable planet with the benefits sucked up to a few. So what can evaluation do in this context? We need evaluation to play a role. So is evaluation fit to address the broader issues of humanity, and in fact of other species as well? It often what evaluation is doing is focusing on accountability rather than how we can really disrupt to build regenerative systems. And we do need to get transformational change. The picture on the right is from the climate investment funds and the way they envisage transformational change, systemic change, speed, scale, adaptive sustainability, etc. And we really need to be bringing this into our thinking. And evaluations often have lots and lots of questions, but often these are not fundamental ones. I really like the thinking about triple loop thinking. So, for example, the DAC sustainability criteria are often dealt with in much too limited a way. And we need to say, are we dealing with these detailed questions while in fact the house is falling down around us? So one of the positive things has been the response from footprint evaluation. And in South Africa, we've developed these guidelines for applying climate and ecosystems in all evaluations, and as well as transformative equity. So there are examples of responses that we can look to. So what do we institutionalize? What role do we need for evaluation? It needs to be more systemic, thinking more broadly about the ecological side of social ecological systems, addressing transformation. They need to focus on use, not just on supply, building the motivation, capability, and opportunity to use evidence, more focus on learning, and they need to address issues of power. And it was interesting to hear Rumbiza's essay yesterday, which really touched on these issues. So we need to think about, what are we focusing on? The role of local stakeholders, the methods that are used, and we need to be prepared to challenge trickle-down growth promises when we are actually living beyond the planetary capacity to support life. So we need to be transformation-focused, asking more meaningful questions, less efficiency-focused, more focusing on resilience with necessary redundancy that's implied in resilience. We need to be thinking about a greater variety of evaluative practices, including more rapid ones, and more thinking about contribution as opposed to attribution. Many of our interventions are not going to make huge differences in themselves. The question is how they contribute to system change. And where have we got to in institutionalization? There has been some progress in the last 7 to 8 years. Some of the original systems date back to 1994 in Colombia's case, for example. We've seen in the last few years Costa Rica, Philippines, Bhutan, Brazil, Tanzania making progress. But we're also seeing some regression in some countries like South Africa and Mexico. But the reality is many countries are wary. They don't want to face the mistakes, and learning is not part of the culture. Some countries are beginning to explore, but many are wary. And agencies are often focusing on their internal logic for their accountability and not focused on building country systems. And I'm going to refer to a UNEG report I was involved in my last slide. But this focus on using your own systems actually often results in weakening capacity. It doesn't build it. So it's not just neutral, it actually weakens capacity. And I really like this paper, which was written 40 years ago on institutional destruction arising from donor and project proliferation in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is an inward focus. And often systems are too government focused, and that means a limited view of the reality. It's very vulnerable to changes in the government or administration. And often we see too much isomorphic mimicry, too much copying of systems from elsewhere, rather than really basing systems in local contexts. So what can countries do? They can integrate evaluative practices into management. We need to find ways to make this part of the management system. We need to seek to build the evaluation ecosystems from the demand side, the supply side, the quality assurance, etc. There's an opportunity to build on existing evaluations. Howard might refer later to work he was involved in Uganda, where they found over 600 existing evaluations. South Africa is doing an evaluation evidence map as well. And we need to be funding synthesis work which builds on these existing evaluations. And we need to consider other models than international, central, or center and expert-led models so that we begin to change the power dynamics. Establishing structures and processes to bring in other stakeholders, involving users in different stages of the project cycle. Elliot, when he spoke yesterday, talked about innovating in how one uses evidence, like citizen assemblies. How can we bring evaluative evidence into models like that? And also, as we start to think about rapid evaluations, we can move away from only thinking of outsourced models to facilitated rapid ones, which help to build capacity within government. It's very important innovation, I think, which will build a lot of capacity and help to create the change of culture that we need. Countries need to focus on what is critical, particularly the issues that are causing the fundamental elements of the polycrisis and how countries can respond. And we need to think about a wider suite of evaluative tools, from evaluative workshops, rapid evaluations, to longer, more rigorous ones, so that we can feed back much more quickly into decision-making processes. And lastly, what can agencies do? And I'm linking here to some findings from a report that I was involved with for UNEG on looking at United Nations contributions to national evaluation capacity development and the evolution of national evaluation systems. And first recommendation was that all United Nations agencies, and we could read that all international agencies, should conduct their evaluations in a way that fosters national evaluation capacity development. And it's meaningful leadership by countries on governance mechanisms for evaluation, not token ones. It's undertaking joint country-led evaluations where countries really are leading, often perhaps funded by international agencies, to do the evaluations on behalf of both national and international, using country systems where these exist, using and building local evaluators. And the second recommendation is that these agencies should continue to support the capacity development of national evaluation ecosystems, including support to the enabling environment, institutional and individual capacity. And it talks about support to diagnosis of the systems, supporting institutional capacity for conducting, involving non-state actors, and supporting the integration of these cross-cutting issues, including climate change in country systems. And lastly, it talks about the need to coordinate and collaborate on NECD and allocating adequate time and resources. And with the UN, with the agencies explicitly including NECD as part of their mandate, rather than a little add-on at the end, with at least 10% of evaluation resources allocated to NECD. I'd just like to end with this global declaration, which was launched in Washington at the beginning of March, and Geeta might come back to this later, where many of our agencies have pointed to the need for the urgency of systemic change to address the global crises. And I think hopefully we can collaborate together, following on for this declaration, to try and make this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. And for those of you who don't know Ian, he's a very eminent human. He's currently the president of the International Evaluation Academy, and he plays a role in a number of other advisory capacities, including working with the Global Evaluation Initiative and the Just Energy Transition in South Africa's presidency. But I'm happy to tell you that Ian is not our only eminent person. We're going to get some responses to what he's had to say. And the first person I'm going to invite to respond is Howard White. Howard is currently the Director of Evaluation and Evidence Synthesis at GDN, but has a very, very distinguished pedigree, having worked in 3IE and at IEG and elsewhere. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Over to you, Howard.
Okay, thank you, Dugan, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and of course, Eid Mubarak. So I'm going to build on some of the comments Ian made, but go a little bit further. And my main argument is, in fact, that the way that aid donors work in evaluation is actually counterproductive. He actually did say this, counterproductive and destructive to institutionalizing evaluation in developing countries, and the whole way of working in aid evaluation departments in donor agencies needs to change. That's my main argument. So let's go back 40 years. My first job was in Lesotho in the planning office. And I remember very well one meeting where the director of planning, our job mainly in planning office wasn't to plan things, it was to approve aid projects. And the director of planning was talking about a village water supply project. And he was asking the project officer, this poor, fairly young woman just out of university, about, so, okay, tell me, what is this project? And said, well, it's water supply. And he said, well, where is it? Where is it? I don't remember the details, but she said something like, well, it's in some of the other districts. I'd have to check the details, like Tapaseka and so on. And he said, no, but where is this project? And she got very flustered, saying, well, I said it's in these districts. He said, but it's here in Lesotho, right? He said, yes, of course. He said, well, why is it called the British Village Water Supply Project? Are we giving water to villages in Britain, or are we giving water to villages here in Lesotho? And this point here is exactly about the question of whose project is this? Why is a water supply project in Lesotho called the British Village Water Supply Project? And this question of who owns the project is a crucial one in debates around aid and aid effectiveness. I'll come back to that, and actually has implications for evaluation, which is my main argument. Now, also whilst I was working in the planning office in Lesotho, some months later, the permanent secretary, the PS, came back from Paris at the meeting in Paris where these DAC meetings are held, and in the meeting of all the staff, he said, oh, we don't talk about donors and recipients anymore, we talk about partners. Remember, this is going back 40 years. Roll on nearly 20 years, and in 2005, we have the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness. That was followed 3 years later by the Accra Agenda for Aid Effectiveness. Then we had the Busan Partnership for Aid Effectiveness in 2011, I think it was. There's some Nairobi Declaration the year after that. And now we have the Global Partnership for Effectiveness in Development Cooperation. And I'll make a couple of points about this. One is that actually when they talk about aid effectiveness, they're not talking about what you and I might think that means. I did my PhD on aid effectiveness. I worked as a researcher on aid effectiveness throughout the 90s. And what I meant by that, and what I've meant by that doing impact evaluation over the last 20 years, is, are these aid projects any good? Do these aid-funded activities make a difference to poor people's lives? That's what we're interested in my aid effectiveness. That's not what aid effectiveness means when they have the Paris Declaration or the Accra Accord. It's about aid management, the ways in which aid is managed. And the first principle, the first point in all of these different declarations is about ownership. And I've just got a couple of slides to share to illustrate a couple of the points I'm saying. So I'm going to try. Can I share my screen, please, organisers? Thank you. And okay, sorry, where's it advanced? No. Oh, there we are. There we go. So this first slide I'm going to share is from the I want to make it big. Here we go. Not working. There you go. It's from the Accra Agenda for Action. It's the same wording across the Paris Declaration and so on. And this first principle of ownership is that countries determine their own development strategies by playing a more active role designing development policies. So I'm quoting this because is this something that really needs saying? Does you really need to have an international declaration where the developed countries get together and agree that India and South Africa and China should be allowed to play a more active role in designing their own development policies? I mean, do you really need that? So it's an indication of what a weird world we're living in, where you think about it, a declaration to say, oh, it's okay if these countries design their own policies. We're going to be in favour of that. It's a very peculiar mindset you've got, where you think that's something that even needs talking about. Anyway, but the key point, though, is despite all of these declarations and meetings and resolutions about increasing ownership as part of aid effectiveness, the donors don't mean it. they've never been willing to relinquish power of their aid programs. And this is true throughout the history of aid. So we go back to the 1950s. There were proposals for the Special United Nations Fund on Economic Development, SUNFED. These days, if you Google SUNFED, I tried it, you get there's a plant-based meat company called SUNFED. There's unsurprisingly solar panel companies called SUNFED, but even Google's forgotten about SUNFED as in the Special United Nations Fund on Economic Development. It's forgotten about it because it never happened. Why did it never happen? Because the donors didn't want such a fund to be under the United Nations. They created instead the International Development Association, the soft loan arm of the World Bank, and put IDA under the World Bank. Why? Because the UN system, SUNFED, would have been subject to the control of developing countries, whereas in the World Bank, where voting power is proportional to subscriptions, which is proportional to GDP, the voting power rests with developed countries. So we wanted this new fund to be under the power of developed countries, not developing countries. Around the same time, UNCTAD, the UN organization UNCTAD, was trying to move its way into aid management. So the A in UNCTAD would have been about aid rather than and for trade and development, for trade, aid and development. And UNCTAD actually came up with the 1% target. It didn't come up with World Council of Security came up with it. But UNCTAD was promoting the 1% target for 1% of GNP to be given in aid. But again, the donors stepped in and said, no, that's not happening. We want control of that. And instead of allowing UNCTAD to play a role in forming aid policy, they created under the OECD the Development Assistance Committee, DAC. And it's DAC that plays a role in determining aid policy. And while there have been some moves to incorporate developing country representatives over the years, this is basically a donor-run committee to take care of aid programs. So donors have never really been serious about this, giving more ownership to developing countries. We see that now in recent years with the proliferation of vertical funds like Gavi and the Global Fund, but also all these global partnerships that come up. Now, I have to admit, I'm a sort of guilty party here, not just I've done evaluations myself in the past, but because I ran a global fund. 3IE is a global fund for impact evaluations, what it is. It didn't work like it was intended to. So when CGD proposed 3IE and Nancy Birdsall was president of CGD proposed 3IE, the idea was to be a levy of 0.25% on aid budgets to carry out independent evaluations, impact evaluations of development programs. But the people, the organizations, DFID, Gates and so on, that put the money into supporting 3IE in the early years said, no, that's not to evaluate us. To go off and do about other stuff that's not there to evaluate us. So that idea didn't really take off. But when I was running 3IE, my idea was very much to run it to finance supply-driven interventions, supply-driven evaluations, not demand-driven evaluations. So to support evaluations that were supply-driven, funding evaluations of programs that governments and development countries are interested in, not demand-driven, where we do an impact evaluation that tests some esoteric, wacky idea for some researcher in Harvard or Yale or London School of Economics or whatever. We did quite a lot of that in the early years of 3IE because of various reasons, but it wasn't my vision for 3IE. So the best example of what was my vision for 3IE were these country policy windows. We managed to do a couple where we worked with country governments to identify their evaluation priorities, and we supported evaluations of those. So in Uganda, there's something called the Government Evaluation Facility run by the Office of Prime Minister. And early on in 3IE, I said, okay, we're only going to fund in Uganda evaluations that are approved by the Government Evaluation Facility. We've got to get ownership from government of this. And we got money from DFID to finance a program called Support to the Government Evaluation Facility, whereby OPA, not Prime Minister, through GEF, would identify some priority areas, and 3IE would fund those evaluations working with government. So we had the idea, well, this is a good idea, and the GEF, the Government Evaluation Facility, is lagging a bit. Perhaps we need other donors to pay into a common fund to fund evaluations of priority to the government in the areas of interest also of these donors who are represented on this Government Evaluation Committee, the GEF Monitoring Evaluation Subcommittee. So the Commissioner for M&E, Timothy Lubanga, and I went round some of the major donors in Kampala saying, would you be interested in paying to this fund? Then we'll commission evaluations, including programs financed by you. And it will help support institutionalization of evaluation in government, give more government more control of the evaluation program of 8 programs that are government programs in Uganda. And for pretty much unanimous response, we had a meeting in OPN and we went around different agencies, was, oh, that's a very interesting idea, but we want to stay responsible for the evaluation of our programs. We're back in the institution 40 years earlier when it's a British Village Water Supply project. I see Dugan's come on. I'm not stopping talking Dugan. I'm coming to the end, but I'm not there yet. So,
Okay.
So really no progress. So if we're serious, we should be having evaluations of development programs, whether aid finance or not, that are commissioned by developing country governments or developing country NGOs. And that's really not happening. I have another slide here. Another slide here. Let's go on. This is a recent report by DAC and looking at development cooperation evaluation systems. And finally, and it does come finally, but at least it's there, they say engaging countries in evaluations not working very well. They organise meetings, make the tea, but they're not actually substantively engaged in doing the evaluations. That really has to change. So Ian mentioned the Uganda evaluation, country evaluation map we did. It was led by a team at Makerere University and partnering with the Office of Prime Minister. Over 600 evaluations, nearly half of those are not having any Ugandan evaluators whatsoever in the evaluation teams. And only 14%, so just over an eighth, 1 in 8 of those evaluations have only Ugandan teams. So that's a ridiculous state of affairs. Recently, I was approached by a colleague in Makerere to prepare a proposal to make a proposal for evaluation and research grant to a well-known Canadian institution. And there's a requirement in that grant, there has to be a PI from Canada. This is not unusual. That research evaluation funders basically are practicing tied aid, but it doesn't go into the official tied aid statistics, where you have to have a researcher from the country giving the money. So my main point is that development agency evaluation departments should stop doing evaluations. Evaluations of development activities, whether aid finance or not, in developing countries should be commissioned by developing country agencies and carried out by developing country evaluators. And the role of developing country evaluating departments will be peer review when they're evaluating their programs and mentoring support to those evaluations. There's precedent here. Two precedents are, one is that, 1 minute.
No, not a 1 minute, 10 seconds.
Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, I'll skip the precedent. So what I'm proposing is, in addition to SDG 17, the partnership target, we have new indicators, and we basically say, let's just look at the last one. What percent of evaluation eligible projects are currently locally commissioned? That figure is currently 0 or close to 0. What percentage are led by developing country researchers? That figure is also near close to 0. So we're serious about this. Stop doing evaluations. If you're a developed country development agency, start supporting evaluations commissioned by developing country governments and NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. I wasn't expecting you to be quite so animated and spicy, but we love it. Thank you very much. Let's hear now, not always. We're now going to hand over to Manny. Manny Jimenez is very well known to many of you. He was also previously with the IEG, but he is currently the Director General of the Independent Evaluation Department at the Asian Development Bank. So Manny, what are your thoughts? Howard's kind of put it out there. Are you going to stop doing evaluation?
Well, you forgot that I also used to work for 3IE. So I am related to all of you. But I'm so glad Howard suggested that aid agencies should stop doing evaluation, and now I can finally retire after trying twice before to do so and having failed miserably. But no, look, I think that Howard raises great points about aid effectiveness in general. And I don't think I have much more to add to what he says about that. I do think that there are, to be fair to the aid agencies, including the UN system, as well as the MDBs, And there are attempts to try to build governance mechanisms and to support that. And I think that is incredibly difficult for many of these aid agencies for a number of reasons. And the kind of things that I think Howard mentioned ought to be done. And I agree that they haven't been fully successful because the deepening of public sector management is just very difficult when you're not fully embedded in the not just the economic but the political systems of the countries. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the topic of this conversation as I understood it. It's about the institutionalization of evaluation in Asia and the Pacific. And I was very lucky to have read, in fact, of a book that had exactly that title that was just published last year by Reinhard Stockmann and other colleagues in Germany. And I was a bit surprised. I thought that Asia and Pacific would be further ahead than other regions on institutionalization. I can't even say it. And what they conclude is that, quote, the institutionalization of evaluation in the political system is rather weak in Asia and the Pacific. In most countries, there are neither laws nor decrees, and it's limited to a few sectors. And parliaments, quote, show little interest in evaluation. And the Asia Pacific civil societies largely do not shape the practice and institution of evaluation, as there is almost no country with a significant implementation and use of it. So I was surprised by that. And when I looked at some of the case studies, in fact, they were a little bit more promising. But I think what that shows is that despite all the advances in this region, it still lags behind for some of the reasons that Howard mentioned earlier. The question is, what can aid agencies do? As I mentioned, I do believe that it is probably not in the mandate of evaluation departments like mine to try and build capacity in these countries. We're very limited. And secondly, and Howard is quite right, our mandate is to serve our institution. Our owners want to know whether or not they're getting their money's worth, and that's why we exist. And evaluation capacity building should be, in fact, the work of the operational part of our institutions on a demand basis. And I think the aid agencies would be willing to do that. But their capacity to do that is also limited. So my only point that I add to what Howard mentioned is that we should move this capacity building part of our work away from the evaluation departments and embed it in the operational part, because their job is really the institution building that's required for the future. Their problem is that when these demands come up, they said we don't have the knowledge and expertise to build evaluation capacity, and then they throw it back in our court. And that's a bit of an issue. So I think that they should build up their evaluation capacity in operations in order to get this thing done. Thanks.
Thank you, Manny. And before I hand over to Geeta, can I just take a moment to congratulate her on her appointment as the head of evaluation at the Global Environmental Facility. And we're looking forward to your take on this very unexpectedly spicy topic. Geeta, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dugan. Thanks to IG and GEI for hosting this rather timely and important event. And I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, as well as the speakers over the last couple of days, for very, very insightful remarks. And as Ian pointed out, recently at a conference in DC, a declaration was drafted addressing many of the important points raised over the course of these last couple of days, promoting evaluation for transformational change covered by Juha, working in partnership, respect for rights and responsibilities, the focus on sustainability. I'd like to encourage you, I think a link has been sent to that declaration. If we could, at least on Earth Day this year, commit to incorporating sustainability dimensions, I think we would have made some headway on this. But I'll hand over to Ian at the end of my talk. So coming to what the Jeff does in the IEO, Ian's presentation today and previous speakers have clearly pointed out to the critical and urgent need to address the links between human and natural systems in evaluation. This, of course, is imperative today if you want to drive effective and coherent policies to address the triple environmental crisis we are facing today, right? The crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, which we all know are the biggest threats to the planet today. So we've made a lot of strides as an evaluation community addressing gender and inclusion in our evaluations through a variety of efforts by countries, by agencies. And I strongly believe that I think we can do this for the environment as well. I think with a few feasible, practical approaches, it's well within country capacity with some assistance. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of the Global Environment Facility, which is, I don't know how many of you know, but it's the financial mechanism for major UN multilateral environment agreements. You all probably have heard about UNFCCC, UNCCD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and about 196 countries have actually ratified to these conventions. So what do countries do as part of being members of these conventions? They set their convention targets and they report on their progress towards these conventions through national reports on certain core environmental indicators. And the GEF, through its enabling activities, actually helps countries meet the reporting requirements through capacity building. And as Manny just pointed out, it's the operational side that actually should do this. Very few independent evaluation units actually have mandates for capacity building. The GEF also provides grants to help countries actually meet their environmental targets. So in short, countries are already sitting on a treasure trove and a gold mine of information and data that can actually feed into evaluations and decision-making. So the GEF Independent Evaluation Office, which I've just begun to lead, following Juha Uito, who presented on the first day, focuses exclusively on environmental evaluation and the evaluation of environmental interventions, as well as associated socio-economic co-benefits. As Ian pointed out earlier, the mandate of agency evaluation units such as ours, or like the ADB, is often limited to assessing project and program effectiveness through evaluations at different levels. So at our office, we build capacity, or at least we think we build capacity and enhance learning throughout the evaluation process. We provide some guidance on the kinds of environmental data that needs to be collected. We involve national stakeholders to address questions on country context. What works, where, why, how. We're holding workshops for ministries to teach them the basic tools of evaluation and also help them effectively leverage their own environmental and economic data, as well as our evaluation findings in tandem to inform policy. So through field visits, we help build capacity through engaging with civil society, try and empower Indigenous communities in the evaluation process. In a recent one on community-based approaches, we worked tremendously with Indigenous communities. The private sector, where and if they're involved, and then government officials. And we try and train local consultants to develop local capacity, and this has clearly improved with time, and COVID actually made us take that to a whole new level when people couldn't travel. So we really try and work very closely with local consultants now. However, you need to reach scale, just like we expect projects and programs to reach scale. We've also got to reach scale in assisting a very large number of country stakeholders through the evaluation process. So what we're doing is we're launching an online training module on environmental evaluation. It will come online next month. We've partnered with several countries. We've also benefited from inputs from GEI to make this now available in local languages through local institutions. And the online modules will address core evaluation concepts and explain terms that you've probably heard of, but what do they mean? What does systems thinking mean? What is unintended and intended consequences? Sometimes we as evaluators try and take this for granted that everybody understands these nuances, but we've tried to kind of demystify some of these terms. So stay tuned, and it'll be available at jefieo.org. So we've done this. Can we do more? Clearly, we need to do more, as Ian pointed out and Howard pointed out. But I think our role needs to be a little more catalytic. We need to demonstrate the value and power of good evaluation. Evaluations that I think should be crisp. They need to be clear, responsive to country needs, insightful on what works, where, why, systematic in approach. We've talked about systemic. It also needs to be systematic, demystifying how things work in a country context and how this can be better conducted through effective partnerships. No agency, no independent evaluation unit can do this alone. And no independent evaluation unit can do it right without building these partnerships, particularly with countries and stakeholders on the ground. So in addition to advocating for evaluation, investing in evaluation training and capacity building like DEI is doing, ensuring and engaging countries to stakeholders as part of the evaluation process, right from the design phase to sharing findings, we think will develop better strategies to improve not only environmental outcomes, but also socioeconomic co-benefits, as well as contribute to improved policies. Policies just not on environment as socioeconomic, but also help build evaluation policies in countries. And as my fellow panelists have also noted, I will reiterate that ownership of the evaluation process, as well as the results of the evaluation, is absolutely instrumental to institutionalizing evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geeta. I'm finding not only the speakers very fascinating, but I'm also really enjoying the conversation on the chat. And I see that Ian has been very actively engaging with people on the question and answer function. Ian, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you, what do you think of the questions that you've been responding to, and where do you think many of our attendees' heads are at? What are they thinking about? Over to you, Ian.
So I think one of the questions which people are raising is about how do you institutionalize authenticity in evaluations? And as I mentioned in my talk, I think some countries are just not open to evaluations. There's no willingness to engage with failure. And I think it's very difficult to take evaluations forward in those places. We need to rather focus on places where there is an openness to doing that, where people are looking to try and improve development outcomes, and there it's possible to do that. In the way you set up the systems, you can set up things which help to ensure that evaluations are credible, and for example, systematizing peer reviews, making sure they're public, etc., and also trying to do them in ways which are constructively critical, not just negative. And evaluators are all too often just completely negative. So I think there's tension between how you ensure effective evaluations, how you encourage policymakers to be open to failure is a critical area to go forward.
So Ian, I mean, I hear you on what needs to be done in developing countries and building capacity at the country government level. But what do you think about the big international institutions? What do they need to be doing so that that process can thrive?
So I mean, I think one aspect is what Howard raised, which is we need to move much more to funds being given to southern countries to do the evaluations and moving away from I mean, the 2000 evaluations, just imagine if those 2000 evaluations were actually done in ways which built capacity in countries, that would have made a huge difference. And in fact, the first evaluation we did in South Africa was part funded by UNICEF in a very open way, which allowed us to pilot the way we wanted to run our system. And on that basis, we decided how we would set up the system. We developed our guidelines, etc. That was a good example of what can be done. But I think that one of the challenges is that, how much the agencies are prepared to ask the deeper questions about paradigms, because all too often we're getting focused on programmatic evaluations when we actually have to ask bigger questions about how we change systems. And at the GEF conference, one of the questions which really arose for me, one of the speakers talked about the need for disruptions. We need to find ways to disrupt the current systems so we can look for new systems which are regenerative and which promote widespread well-being rather than this destructive path that we're on. And too many agency evaluations are focusing on the interventions because of this accountability demand by the donors. Is this money on this program going right? We need to be asked, they need to have the courage to ask bigger questions about how we make systems work better.
Let's hear from some of the other members of the panel. Manny, what's on your mind?
So I just want to follow up on this thought that also Geeta raised on how do we make sure that we try to develop systems that are owned by the countries. And I'm thinking of, look, any other kind of development project that a country has. Just like a road, we could think of a project which is to build an evaluation system in a country. What do you have to do? You have to, one of the things you have to do is to argue what are the benefits and costs of this project. What are the benefits and costs of an evaluation system? And I believe that the MDBs would fund this. Now, I think the challenge for us as evaluators is we know how much evaluations cost, but can we actually document what are the benefits of evaluation in the development of a country? And I think we're hard-pressed to do that. And I think the challenge for us as a development community is to think and systematically, rigorously try to show how doing good evaluations is good for development and it's good for poor people. Okay. It's not whether or not the project is doing good, it's whether the process of doing evaluations means you're bringing up evidence that informs policy making and is being used to actually improve development policies and projects. I think that's a challenge for all of us.
I think making a better pitch for evaluation is definitely something we need to get better at. And as you say, making the benefits more visible will make it an easier sell. Howard, provided you don't show any more slides and you behave very, very nicely, I'm going to hand over to you.
I showed 3 slides. You don't like 20. Okay, so there have been some very good and potential criticisms or problems of what I'm saying, and maybe I have a certain youthful naivety in what I'm suggesting. I think the point Ian made about being basically opportunistic and starting this approach in the countries which have a good commitment to evaluation, we know which they are, and basically And there's a question about where's the money going to come from? I haven't got the money. It's from the evaluation budgets and the money in projects already earmarked for M&E. That's more than enough money to finance these evaluations locally than they're getting cost done by international consultants. And there's concerns being raised around quality. I look at a lot of evaluations in my work of doing systematic reviewing. There are a lot of bad quality evaluations being done already by international led teams, international teams as well. And I think there's a real need to up the game in terms of evaluation quality. And the need there is for evaluation standards. And that's something that indeed something like DAC can do. They have evaluation standards, but they're actually about like how you manage an evaluation. They're not what I mean by evaluation standards, where you're actually talking about how good an evaluation could be in terms of the confidence you can have in its findings. I think there's a very legitimate point being raised about a lot of regimes not open to criticism and how you get around this. And that's why I'm saying, well, be opportunistic, go where you can to start with and lead by example and work with those governments and those civil society organizations. But I think this is a place where international resolutions actually can play some role. So rather than having international resolutions about, oh, governments should be allowed to do their own policies, have resolutions around the need for transparency and reporting findings around the effects of interventions and policies and programs and so on. And along the lines that Emmanuel was just saying, to show the benefits of this. I agree it will be difficult. There are places I've worked with where they've not really made findings public, and depends on the subject. Actually, immediately before this meeting, there was another meeting on a study in the UK on a particular police operation, and it was a PhD, and the external referee was required to burn the PhD after having refereeing it, because it's not allowed to be in the public domain for 5 years. And so they've got these considerations around some sensitive issues, but there's a more general reluctance to anything public domain, really, any questions of criticising government. I know that, and those places will take longer to adopt this approach. I mean, just very briefly, and I've stopped. It was raised, I mentioned it there, the issue about aid donors are accountable to their boards, to their public, which I think they are. But that's done, but so I'm not saying it shouldn't be evaluation. They should quality assess, peer review the evaluations done of things they're financing, and those evaluations serve their accountability function. So they can play some role in sort of curating the evidence related to the programs they've been helping support from the evaluations that have been locally commissioned. And sorry, just to say, of course, there are a lot of locally commissioned evaluations, particularly in South Asia. But in Africa, I know from doing evidence maps in South Asia and in Africa, across most of Africa, South Africa is an exception, there are very few locally commissioned evaluations. There are some, the majority externally commissioned.
Geeta, to turn the spotlight on you. One of the questions in the chat box was about the environmental, social, and governance standards that are getting practiced more widely, and it noted that people are tending to use the environmental standards rather than the social and the governance. And I think the questioner was raising the need to have a kind of balanced and integrated perspective. How do you think evaluation can do that? Because I think there's so many different things that we need to balance as we travel in this very complex world that we've built.
It's a very good question. And I think for the longest time, there was this bifurcation between environment and social and other economic domains, right? So economists wouldn't pay attention to the environmental dimensions, and environmentalists wouldn't worry about the socioeconomic side. And I think the SDGs, since it's not been mentioned here, I think the SDGs actually raise some of that, in this layered cake, pointing to the links between environment and socioeconomic. We've all been through COVID. COVID has just demonstrated these strong links. So I think there will be, it's not just going to be environment, but also social ESG in totality that will play a role. I want to also reflect a little bit on what's been said earlier. In addition to my feeling about evaluations being crisp, I think we've got to change the image of evaluations a little bit. This whole thought about, oh, here are these people coming in 5 years later or 10 years later, we've moved on. it's not just in our institutions, it's also people in countries who have this image, right? So we've moved on, the country's moved on. So how can we demonstrate that evaluations can also be nimble, they can be flexible, they can be timely, because if policies are changing and if governments change pretty, not like in previous years where it was 20 years, et cetera, to a particular government, how can evaluation actually play a role in helping drive current changes and informing current policies? So real-time evaluations are going to become more and more important and more popular. So I think this part of this role is also to change this image of evaluation. And while we may know the difference, sometimes people view us as auditors, and we're not auditors, right? So we've got to make this distinction clear, as well as say, how can evaluation bring value to the current debates based on previous evidence, but also looking more and more at what's happening currently. So one thing, we are pushing to do in our unit is every time we look at past evidence, we're also looking at current programs to see how well are these lessons at least being incorporated in ongoing projects and in recently designed interventions. Thank you, over.
Thank you, Geeta. We've got a couple of minutes before we need to end the session, and I hope everybody remembers that we're going to stop and then we have a break, and then the second session today will continue, and that's looking particularly at innovation and technology, as well as providing an overview of all of the sessions that have been part of this Future of Evaluation series. I think one thing that struck me, two things that struck me. Firstly, the consensus that that this is an important thing and that international institutions have a role to play. I don't really mind whether it's in their operations function or in their evaluation shop, but it needs to be done. And I think the other thing that's very interesting is the political dimension to all of this, that while developing country governments do need to build evaluative capacity, international agencies also have a mandate and a responsibility that they need to execute. Last couple of minutes, I'm going to turn to you last, Ian. Final thoughts from you, Manny. Literally 30 seconds.
So I think that we should really look at this issue of holding ourselves accountable as evaluators for just coming up with examples of where it is that evaluations have done good. I think that'll go a long way towards trying to stimulate more demand for this work in countries. Thanks.
Thanks, Manny. And how about you, Howard?
So please take this seriously. Don't just say, oh, that's very spicy, and then go away and business as usual. We need to transform the way evaluations are funded and done. And let's start with that now. I put up my revised SDG 17 goal. Please adopt it and work to it.
Please don't take my lightheartedness as an indication that I don't think this is very serious. This is the work of the GEI. We think it's very, very important, and we are dedicated to it. It's our core mission. I would love to see your additions to SDG 17, so please share them with us. But Geeta, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I would just completely agree with what's been said, and let's demonstrate and show by example of what we are truly capable of and how we can drive the change first.
Great stuff. And Ian, your closing thoughts.
So I think a key thing is the need for systems. It's no good just talking about individual evaluations. You can use individual evaluations to help build systems, but it's only when you have systems that you can get the quality assurance, the transparency, you're much more likely to get use, etc. And just to it's for those that want to pursue that, it's really important to speak to GEI, to speak to Dugan and the team, and see how we can share experience around this. But the one thing I want to make is that I raised it and Geeta came back to it. This point about we need to go wider in our thinking of what evaluations are. And rapid evaluations is I think a sine qua non now. I mean, in South Africa, it's really taking off. We really need to look at this, but we also need other models where we bring evaluative thinking into monitoring, because we're going to need to be much more responsive, to have much more adaptive management processes. And finally, I think just on the declaration that Geeta talked about, that join us on that journey, on that declaration.
A lot of people have been asking about how they're going to get access to the recording of this session and Ian's PowerPoint. I'm hoping the organizers will send you all an email with links to the necessary materials. Just to remind you, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We will reconvene at 15:15. We hope you will join us again. I want to give a very, very big thank you to our speakers today and the members of the panel, to Sabine for opening. And thank you very, very much. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and we will see you in 15 minutes. Thanks very much, everybody.